In our study of the synthesis of yoga, we have been dwelling upon the chapter titled Oneness, where in the conclusion of the yoga of integral knowledge, Sri Aurobindo brings us to the epitome of the integral knowledge and the integral yoga by describing it in these terms: the complete realization of unity is therefore the essence of the integral knowledge and of the integral yoga. And on the other side, he says, this realization of oneness and its practice of oneness in difference is the whole of the yoga. So there is the essence of the yoga and there is the whole of the yoga. Both are now defined in terms of this essential realization of oneness. How we got to that, you will recall a gradual movement of withdrawal of the center of consciousness from its false identification with the life, mind and body, disengaging itself, discovering the pure silent Brahman and finding in it the means of liberation from its own personality, being established in that poise of the impersonal Brahman, from there turning around, flowing along the same movement of the divine manifestation to re-embrace the whole cosmos. This was the means which Sri Aurobindo has described as the most rapid by which we can know both the silent and the active Brahman and live in that unity. Now that practically that unity and the experience of that oneness is the unity of the Satchidananda which forms it all. To be able to experience that unity in all things, in all states, in all circumstances, that is the direction in which this realization becomes complete and perfect. But it's not enough to say all, because when you start enumerating, the universe is so diverse, the universe is so complex, that all is still insufficient. There has to be some way by which you can map out what is this all in a way that is not reductionist, which captures essentially the entire structure of the cosmos, and in that you can measure whether the experience you have of unity is complete. And it is to this that Sri Aurobindo comes in the paragraph that we have been studying the last 2 or 3 sessions. He says, Satchidananda is one in himself, in whatever status or whatever plane of existence. And so that is what we make the basis of all of our consciousness and knowledge, will, action, delight, etc. And so this he describes in 3 phases. First is living in the consciousness of the Absolute. Second is finding Him as knowing all, sanctioning all, governing all. And the third, seeing Him as one existence across all the planes. And it is this where we have been dwelling upon the last 2 sessions. Seeing Him as one existence across the entire cosmos. And in this, he describes the 7 planes, the 7 statuses through which the divine manifests himself, the 7 principles of the manifest being of Satchidananda, as he describes it. And each of these we have dwelt upon, but the totality of them and the way he articulates this totality is something so beautiful, so deeply satisfying, that we will explore this a little before we move on. Sri Aurobindo describes the whole of the cosmos as one being of Satchidananda. If you had to describe a person, how would you describe a person? Well, since we look with the eyes outside in, we would start with the body. And then we would describe how the person interacts with you and exchange of energies and emotions. And then we would go more deeply to how the person thinks, what are the motivations which make for this behavior. And then you would go still deeper, if one can glimpse that, to something more essential, more permanent. Because in all that we have described at first, we see a personality changing. As a child, this person was such and such. As a teenager, he was a completely different. As an adult, different. And then further in late maturity of life, a very different person. And yet something is passing through all these stages which is consistent, which makes for it to be the same person. And if we had a wider vision, we would see that person across lives. And we would see the thread which links them all. Even as the personalities change, sometimes quite radically. And if we could go all the way to that, what would be our starting point for describing a person? Rather than focusing on the changing surface appearances of the personality, we would go straight to that thread. This is the person. And then this person puts on these layers. This person puts on these patterns of behavior, these personalities, and so on. But those would be secondary. So when Sri Aurobindo describes the whole of the cosmos as one being, he begins, of course, with that which is the most essential. And it is the Sat. He describes it thus: we have to see him as one existence, being gathered in itself and being displayed in all existences. Always in each of these planes you will see this double movement, the movement of gathering into unity and then the movement of playing in difference while still being one. So first there is this sheer being. Now we can draw analogies or we can sense intuitively there is the sheer presence of the one. But that presence holds this double aspect, concentrated in itself and then representing itself in all things. Then the second aspect from there emerging, the Chit, as one consciousness concentrated in the unity of its existence, extended in universal nature, and many-centered in innumerable beings. So remember, we have to see the divine in this way. We have to see cosmos, the whole manifestation in this way. So you're seeing one consciousness. First it is gathered in itself. It knows itself. It knows itself innumerably. And as it deploys its innumerable possibilities, it extends itself into what we call universal nature. The whole universe expanding out is just this concentrated awareness and being now spreading out to become everything. Everything is essentially consciousness that is being. But then it also takes a special position of appearing as sparks, centers of consciousness everywhere in this nature. And many centered in innumerable beings. How many are there? The mind instinctively wants to give a number. Well, our galaxy has, the latest count, billions of Earth-like planets. One galaxy. And how many galaxies? Trillions, uncountable. But is there an end? And on each of those there are some life forms. However rudimentary or however complex, there are life forms everywhere. How many? And we would want to give a number. But the reality is, it is innumerable, because the universe is infinite and there is no end. And for us to conceive of that is already overwhelming to the mind. But this is how we have to see the divine. Conscious being, deploying as a conscious nature, and then centering itself innumerably. many-centered in innumerable beings. And the third facet, one force static in its repose of self-gathered consciousness and dynamic in its activity of extended consciousness. So from the consciousness comes the action of consciousness. As there was first sheer existence which is conscious, now you have consciousness which is active. And so one force resting in the consciousness and then deploying itself. Dynamic in activity of extended consciousness. Everywhere there is consciousness, there is force. Force in movement. So anywhere you go in the universe, in the most empty so-called space, you have existence which is conscious and which is therefore active. The action may not be visible to you, but it's always there. So if you see the development of modern science, it begins with these infantile ideas of empty space. But very quickly, as it begins to explore, it discovers there is no such thing as empty space. It's always full of something. And at first you find just energy is flowing, eventually you find it is something much more than just energy is flowing. Profound, intense, massive energy, of which we measure only a surface ripple. But this is everywhere in action. And the whole universe can be seen as this movement of pure force, forming itself. And so we have three visions already. Sheer existence, which is overwhelming, innumerable consciousness, which is enormous ocean of force, movement. And then the next facet, one delight, blissfully aware of its featureless infinity and blissfully aware of all feature, form, force and form as itself. And what is this whole movement about? It is the sheer existence, that is consciousness, that is delight, playing out. But the delight also has this double poise. When it turns to itself, aware of its infinity, without forms, inwardly concentrated on itself, delight, enjoying its own infinite delight. And again, what it means, infinite delight means it is never a monotone. You see, human happiness always fundamentally is limited. I am happy and I can turn my attention to my own happiness. I am happy to be happy. And then after a while, it grows kind of tired. Okay, I've been happy to be happy, now it's 1 hour, what next? And you start becoming unhappy because your happiness is not enough. Because it's a monotone, it's flat. How much more can you draw out of it? That's all that it can give. Somewhere it fails because it cannot continue forever. It doesn't have enough. But the nature of the ananda, the delight of the divine is infinite. It's always pouring out, always fresh, always new. A new aspect, a new facet, a new quality emerging, ever renewed, never repeating itself. And so you can remain immersed in the delight enjoying its own delight, and remain in it infinitely, eternally, and never be bored because it never ends. But this whole movement which is dwelling in itself equally pours out and dwells in itself as all things. And so he describes it this way: one delight, blissfully aware of its featureless infinity and blissfully aware of all feature and force and forms as itself. Meaning the force, features, forms have been created out of the delight. They are made of the delight. It's not delight enjoying those things. It's not delight entering and enjoying from within or from outside. It is the very substance of delight that makes up this whole universe. The table, the wood, the stone, even the substance of our cells, everything is form of delight. The delight of the divine enjoying himself in and as form, and he uses three words: feature and force and form as itself. And feature is much more subtle in that which is featureless, as a first ripple that comes, a first experience of some distinguished quality, that asserting itself, activating itself becomes force. The force repeating itself unendingly becomes the appearance of form. But on all three levels, it is the same expression of pure delight. And so we have a third vision of the universe, which is one of the very substance of delight. Well, fourth vision, because we had force as consciousness and force separate. So four visions of the universe, in which the Satchidananda has formulated itself. And each of these you can take as a theme of meditation. Read that line perhaps, dwell upon it, on its double aspect, the internal, subjective and the objective manifest form of it in the universe. And each is a facet of the one divine being that is the universe, the cosmos. But these four represent the higher statuses in which the divine is revealed. In each of these, in the Sat, in the Chit, in the Shakti, and in the Ananda, it is the divine himself as that. And you see it as that, there is nothing else that could be seen. In the next few, again four will come here, you will find gradually there is the possibility of hiding, veiling. So in the very next one, fifth vision, one creative knowledge and governing will, supramental, originative and determinative of all minds, lives and bodies. And we dwelt upon this a little before, so I won't repeat what we had discussed of each of these words, what it means to be creative knowledge, governing will, supramental, originative, determinative. We saw each of these and the deeper sense of them. But you will see here a single idea of this knowledge will deploying itself, determining everything. And by everything it is meant a scale that not only covers all space, but across all time, and all possibilities across all space and all time. All is known to this supramental vision that sees infinite possibilities, concentrates to deploy some selections of them, but holding it all always in perfect relation with everything else. To go back to an example we've used before, if you take a single grain of sand and you move it from one place to another, just 1 foot away, in that movement you see something changing. The grain of sand which was here was in relation with the things around it, maybe even on your hand. It was in relation with all the atoms of your hand and all the stars in the universe. There's a perfect relation, gravitational, electromagnetic, and all other forces and energies that you can imagine. Even the light striking it is in perfect relation, mathematically describable, so perfect. When you lift it and place it elsewhere, again it is in perfect relation with everything in the universe, mathematically describable. So when you lift one grain and place it a foot away, the entire universe and all its relations with this grain have changed instantaneously for this movement to be possible. If you moved it from here to here and the universe remained what it was, the grain couldn't be here. It would break that perfect alignment. Now imagine the mind of God, if we may use that term, in which this right relation of the grain is held with the universe, and as you move the grain of sand, the entire universe reshapes itself to adjust to this movement of the grain and remaining perfectly in relation. And not only with this one grain, but with the other grain, and with the other grain, and with the other grain, and the wave of water which comes to scatter these 1,000 grains, and the ocean moving, and everything in perfect relation with itself, constantly in a perfect awareness of their right relation. This is the nature of the supramental consciousness. This is the nature of the knowledge and the will with which the divine holds the whole universe, forms the whole universe, and lives in the universe. And this is the power, one creative knowledge and governing will. Supramental, originative and determinative of all minds, lives and bodies. And we see this vision. It is overwhelming, but this too is form and aspect of the divine. And this is the kind of consciousness into which our minds are struggling to awaken. Our mind's evolution is on the borderline approaching the supermind. It is still like a little drop in the ocean. It cannot even conceive of the wholeness of the ocean, but it's struggling. And the fact that it's struggling means something in nature is preparing to break out of its limits. And just across the border is this massive, creative, determinative consciousness, supramental. And here we see oneness and multiplicity fully held. The next three poises of the divine consciousness progressively will conceal the oneness of the divine more and more. And so the next is one mind. We conceive of the divine as one mind. Remember, this was the mind which is holding everything supramental, knowing everything perfectly, intimately. But this mind now can as if flatten out, lose its incredible complexity and wholeness, and become just one awareness, mental, limited somewhat, although infinite. One mind containing all mental beings and constituting all mental activities. So we have this habit of seeing each person and their thoughts as separate. But we have to learn to visualize, conceptualize one mental consciousness that fills the universe, which holds its awareness of things. And of that mental consciousness, a special concentration and formulation in each person's brain, mind. And that's what makes for our distinctions. But we are like little bubbles inside the ocean. Little whirls, you may say, of awareness, mental, forming itself in each brain for a few decades. That's about all a human lifespan is. And then breaking free of the body to form a new particular form of whirl in a new body, and so on, but always living inside this one ocean in which this little whirl of your mind is part of a much larger whirl of a collective mind and awareness, which is part of a much larger, complete universal mind. One mind containing all mental beings, constituting all their activities. So the substance which forms our mind's processes is the same universal substance which forms all mind processes. But that substance is not monotone in that sense. It has also gradations, a range in which it can play. So you can have a denser grade of substance or a refined grade of substance, dulled and darkened mental substance or brightened, clarified, awakened mental substance. And you'll notice how this shifts the play of the material. You see, if the water is muddy, light cannot play inside it. It becomes sticky, sludge, it doesn't move easily. The same water becoming clarified, pure, the light penetrates and plays, creates many patterns, and the water flows freely. And the same happens with our mind. So when you're in a space where there is this stickiness, dullness of the mental energies, your mind becomes heavy, dull, and is unable to see clearly. You enter a space where the mind is clarified and pure, it washes through, purifies your own mind, and after a while suddenly your thoughts become clearer, brighter, fresher, positive, lit up. The knowledge and the access to knowledge is easier. A simple experiment: go into a space which is the most crude, often in the marketplace, when the most violent energies are playing, pulling, pushing, greed, desires, and then you see how it changes your thinking. You step out of that, perhaps briefly you feel a sense of relief, but notice how the thought patterns change. Enter a sacred space where there's a strong, clear presence. Go into the Mantra gardens, already everything shifts. You think differently, and you made no effort. What happened? Your little mind, which is part of this universal flow, was just washed out by the clarity of the environing mind substance. Now imagine if this is true of variations in space within a few hundred meters. How much this variation might be when you go a few thousand kilometers, or when you go from one planet to another, from one solar system to another, from galaxy to another. Maybe the variations are even bigger, we don't know. So just as an environment locally can have a clear or dull mental substance, there are also larger patches, not only of clarity or dullness, but of patterns of behavior, habitual rhythms of thought, which form collective spaces of entire townships, of entire countries or nations, and even of entire planets. And when you move from one to the other, your behavior is shaped inside out and you do not even realize it. It's a common experience when you emigrate from one country to another. Very quickly your behavior changes and becomes similar to those who live where you have gone. And you may think, oh yeah, I have adapted, but what has happened? You didn't make much effort. It's the environing consciousness filling and changing your thought patterns. Not fundamentally, secretly, behind the scenes. You still have old habits, but something has shifted in the substance, not in the patterns of your thought. When the substance changes, there's a shift in the patterns. However much you may cling to them, eventually they will also change. Now all of this comes with this single recognition that there is one mind containing all mental beings and constituting their activities. The mind contains you and makes you in the mental awareness. And we realize how silly it is to claim the right of your mind's capacities, of your intelligence, or even to identify with this particular mind formation and say, this is me. To change your mind, to be free of this, even to take on a new mind form, should not bother you, because you are not the mind. You have a mind which is accumulated from this environing mental substance. Next, one life. One life active in all living beings and generative of their vital activities. Very similar to the mind discussion, but now at the level of life energies. There's one gigantic, massive prana, life force filling the whole cosmos, which surrounds you, fills you, and generates your vital activities. What keeps you alive? This life force. What distinguishes your life from another is the whirlpool within you as distinct from the whirlpool in another. A whirlpool in the ocean can exist separate, seeming separate. Except if you observe carefully, water from outside is entering the whirlpool, water from inside is exiting the whirlpool. The water is being exchanged continuously with the rest of the ocean. The form of the whirlpool is all that is constant. And so within us, while there is a whirlpool of the energy recirculating, in complex world, not so simple as one rotation, in a complex world, still there is a continuous exchange, drawing fresh energy from outside and pushing old energy outside. The nature of this exchange is what determines the strength and the quality of your whirlpool. So again, as with the mind, we draw the quality of energy from outside. How much we are able to contain determines how much we have to do what we want to do. There are those in whom the barriers are tight, so very little comes from outside. They need to feel energetic. There are those in whom the barriers are more fluid. They can draw enormous energies directly from the universe and express themselves, needing very little food. They always have lots of energy to spill. And this balance is something you can consciously modulate. But you recognize all the energy within you is not yours. And again, you can consider how much we falsely identify with our emotional and energy patterns. I hate this. I love that. I am generous. I will never forgive. All of these patterns of human pulls and pushes and energy flows, so superficial. Drawing on universal energies, repeating in false patterns, you could just drop them, rebuild afresh. You could flow out from deep within you to form a whole new pattern of relations and energies, replacing the old, casting them off like a snake drops its skin, comes out with a completely new form and skin. I take this analogy to show that it can be smooth. It does not suffer in the dropping, shedding of its old skin. The suffering is only to disengage from the old which is still stuck. But you are happy to be free of it. And we have to consciously begin to orient ourselves to let go of these past and false formations, both in our thought and in our energies. But the same principle applies also in the physical substance of our bodies. That is more difficult to do though. But here he says, one substance constituting all forms and objects as the visible and sensible mold in which mind and life manifest. So we now conceive of the divine not only as universal mind, not only as universal life, but one substance. And he does not use the word matter. He says, one substance constituting all forms and objects as the visible and sensible mold. So anything which is visible and sensible as substance is included here. You see, the moment you say matter, you will limit yourself into a very narrow band of what is for you matter. But actually matter has many gradations also. And so he says anything which is sensible or visible. Why again the difference between visible and sensible? Because in fact, the subtler gradations of matter are often not visible, though they can be sensed. Equally, there are some where they are visible, but they are not sensible. And the two words cover between them the full spectrum of that substantiality. He suggests also the substantiality is not limited to physical matter only, it includes also other domains. There is even a substance which is a substance of force, substance of mind, and so on. All these are included in this description. So there is as if a substance, universal, which is one, giving you a mold in which mind and life can manifest and play. And this is what we are seeing, sensing in our body, which is of course to us only the most dense, gross part of the substance. There are much finer gradations of substance, including the subtle physical and other, which are sensed and perceived in the aura, all of which still form the mold in which mind and life can play. Now in this last also the same principle applies. We make a false attachment to this mold. Why? Because as far as our surface memory goes, that's all I have been. I don't remember my births, but I have distant memories of early childhood. And from then on, little more and more until the memory becomes somewhat stable, and this is me. So the memory on the mind, which is itself a limited formation and temporary, has attached itself to this body form, which is also temporary formation, and this life energy form, which is also temporary formation. And as long as I identify myself with this, I am only this, I'm bound. And I fear. I fear losing each of these things. I fear breaking free of these limitations. It's as if you're happy to be in your familiar jail cell. You come back home to your little prison because being free of it is too much, too scary. In one of the poems Sri Aurobindo wrote while in prison physically, he writes, "Not in the petty circle of cities, cramped by your doors and your walls, I dwell." And he is out in the open spaces, and it's the consciousness liberated from this small little cell. Here we are seeing the full spectrum from the Sat, Chit, Shakti, Ananda, supermind, mind, life, matter. The full spectrum of being and the 7 facets of being that form the one divine being. Each of these facets we have seen almost as a separate domain in itself, but in fact each of these facets spans the whole cosmos. Again, to take an analogy, if you're describing a person and you describe the mind, you will generally tend to focus on the head, which is the seat of conscious mind. You describe the emotions, you will tend to focus on the chest, the seat of the emotions. But where is your mind's awareness? Everywhere. Where are your emotions? They span your whole being. And in the same way, all 7 are spanning across. The substance which we know as matter is only the densest of the full range of substance. The consciousness which we know as Chit, having its own pure plane of expression, spans the entire cosmos supporting it. And so we have a very complex picture of 7 principles spreading across all 7. But there's an interesting relation. And this is what he says in this last part of the sentence. When he says this substance in which mind and life manifest and act, just as one pure existence is that ether in which all conscious force and delight exist, unified, and find themselves variously. And just with this, he gives you a picture. Right on top is the ether of the existence in which consciousness and force play in delight. Right at the bottom is matter in which mind and life play in their evolution. And so you have as if this from above a movement of expression, from below a movement of expression, and the top corresponds to the bottom. Now this immediately gives you an insight which is elaborated in the Life Divine in an entire chapter or 2, particularly the chapter titled The Sevenfold Chord of Being. And he says, we may therefore pose 8 principles, and then we perceive that our existence is a sort of refraction of the divine existence. So our existence here, divine existence there. Sat Chit Ananda, and here matter, life, mind, and this is a refraction. In inverted order of ascent and descent, thus arranged. And he says, existence corresponds to matter, consciousness force corresponds to life, the bliss corresponds to the psyche. And then supermind corresponds to mind. Now if you look at the upper half, everything is built on a fundamental unity, the divine revealed. The lower half, everything is as if built out of pieces assembled, and so the divine is concealed. Because our body is built up of so many atoms aggregated, the underlying unity is hidden by the pieces that have come to join it. Because our mind itself is built of so many thoughts, ideas, it seems as if it's an accumulation of experiences and thoughts and ideas, and the underlying unity is lost or hidden. And so we have two domains, one in which the divine unity is revealed, one in which the unity is concealed. And the two are as if one reflecting the other. And this picture is so important. Not only is it true when you look at the whole cosmos, it is true of us. Within us, there are these deeper parts of which we are unconscious, of which the surface parts of which we are conscious are a reflection. And we don't know it. And so we are playing in the domain of reflection, struggling to find that oneness, which we cannot, obviously, because it's built of pieces. And we feel lost, we feel helpless, we feel insufficient, and then we suffer and all the rest of the consequences. Plato has a beautiful image of a group of people who have been tied down in a cave with a fire behind them and the reflection of their form on the wall in front of them. And they're so fixated on the reflection, they think they are the reflection. So when they move, the reflections move, but they think they are the reflection there. And all of their life they live in this false identification. The analogy goes deep. If you step out of the cave, somehow you break free of those chains and you step out of the cave, you are blinded by the light outside. The light is blinding, and the cave is your safe refuge of darkness or semi-darkness. On the other hand, someone who lives outside is so used to the daylight, to enter the cave is to enter this dimly lit or semi-dark space of appearances and false reflections. The analogy is so perfect to describe our own internal and external reality. So this description which he gives here is profound, and with a few suggestions, he points us to some of these deep insights which are elaborated in the Life Divine in those chapters. But the immediate next paragraph catches this split or apparent duality. The integral yoga of knowledge has to recognize the double nature of this manifestation. For there is the higher nature of Satchidananda in which he is found, and the lower nature of mind, life and body in which he is veiled. And to reconcile and unite the two in the oneness of the illumined realization. So now considering, let's say, one has thus embraced the whole cosmos from the poise of the oneness of the silent Brahman, now re-embracing the whole creation as the active Brahman and living in this oneness. Having defined the scale and scope of the oneness, which we must be able to live in, to find and to see. And the full cosmos is now included. We still have to face this duality, this division. Because in certain parts of the cosmos, he is one and revealed. In certain parts, he is concealed in apparent division. And how are you to reconcile these two? Although in the consciousness you see it, in the action there is a practical gap, a sense of a division. And this becomes the theme of the next paragraph. But before we take that up, just observe, in this sequence he has described 8 gradations, Chit and Shakti, consciousness and force being separated. In the life divine, it is a slightly different mapping. Their consciousness and force are kept together, but he connects the bliss with the psyche. And if you see in the sequence, the bliss being just before supermind, the psyche is just below mind. And you notice the psyche, that is the sense of your own independent identity, is felt not in the raw emotions, not in the objective thinking mind, but somewhere in between. That's the point where you're able to most easily connect with the deepest inmost soul. And that inmost soul, the psychic being, as Sri Aurobindo calls it, is also the center of the delight. It is the Ananda aspect of the Satchidananda which is most represented there. We used this reference last time also. Mother describes these 4 parts of our being. Our mind is destined to become a vehicle, the divine knowledge. Our life energies are destined to become a vehicle for the divine power. Our body, a vehicle for the divine beauty and perfection. And our soul, the vehicle of the divine love. And you see these aspects of the Satchidananda represented here. And implied is this, that in the evolution, each of these parts grows into its equivalent, its principle, which it manifests here. Now, why was the cosmos made in this way? There are many ways you can answer that question. All of these aspects are needed to have the experience of cosmos. But most important, the purpose of this manifestation was to play out the delight in multiplicity. And you could have had a multiplicity in which everyone always knew from the beginning that they are divine. And it would have been a universe which would be interesting. There would be no darkness, no suffering, no conflict. Because right from the beginning, the divine multiplies himself and all are consciously awakened to their divinity. Very simple world. But the full play of the divine possibilities includes the possibility of self-forgetfulness. The full play includes the possibility of conflict. Now, we could, for example, have had no conflict because we are all conscious of our divinity, but we might want to play at conflict. Like children play in kindergarten, they will say, now you are my enemy, now let's go and attack him. So we used to play in kindergarten, somebody would be called, he is king, and so someone had to be queen, and then someone would be minister. Now what do? We have soldiers, attack so and so, go and conquer this, do that. And we would, generally I was the outlaw. I had to run and everybody was chasing me. But why do you need to play? Because it's part of the possibility and the delight of the play. If you take this logic to its conclusion, the delight of the play can be pushed how far? To breaking point. Until it seems as if everything is lost, everything is fragmented and broken up, unrecoverable. And to push that play all the way to that limit, even to convince yourself that it is unrecoverable, that has an edge of delight, a completeness to the play which could not be possible in that purely revealed divine expression. Even if that was there, to push to that limit would have a joy of delight which you could not experience in the pure revealed divinity. So, in the scheme of the play, you could start with revealed divinity and enter the expression of or exploration of concealed divinity, or you could plunge straight in sheer delight at the experience of concealed divinity. Vroom, big bang, blasting out. Oneness lost in darkness, in sheer delight. and then from there struggle through the full awakening, which would make for the most complete and rich experience of all the gradations in between across the entire cosmos. And it is such that this universe is. It need not have been like that. But having chosen this path, it makes for the most complete exploration of all possibilities of divinity and play of divinity, including the most crude and perverse forms of the struggle and strife. And that's why we pass through these stages also in our evolution. So, we were looking at this from this context, that everything here is already holding in itself concealed that divinity. And the whole process of awakening is what makes for the delight. Here in the human consciousness as we are today, we have come up to that point where we are on the border, the limits that our mind is able to go to, and turning now to the possibility of breaking through this barrier. So of this, Sri Aurobindo says, the divine descends from pure existence through the play of consciousness, force and bliss, and the creative medium of supermind into cosmic being. We ascend from matter through a developing life, soul and mind, and the illuminating medium of supermind towards the divine being. You see, both are moving to divine being. One to cosmic being, the other to divine being. Okay. The knot of the two, the higher and the lower hemisphere, is where mind and supermind meet with a veil between them. The rending of the veil is the condition of the divine life in humanity. For by that rending, by the illumining descent of the higher into the nature of the lower being, and the forceful ascent of the lower being into the nature of the higher, mind can recover its divine light in the all-comprehending supermind. The soul realizes its divine self in the all-possessing, all-blissful Ananda. Life repossesses its divine power in the play of the omnipotent conscious force, and matter open to its divine liberty as a form of the divine existence. So these upper four and lower four join when this veil is rent. And then there is a double movement, the higher descends and the lower forcefully ascends. But the veil is what separates. The veil is what now evolution is struggling to break. Now this point in the evolutionary journey is so important. All the struggles of the past billions of years has brought us to this. And after we break through, the entire following process is one of increasing divinization, both in awakening and in transforming by the descent of the divine. This veil is the last remaining struggle of evolution. And we are at this point as a collective. Perhaps not the mass of the collective, but at least the upper edge of the conscious aspiring collective. An elite, in a sense, because they choose to explore this transition. Pioneers, as Sri Aurobindo describes it, of a new age, of a new consciousness. And here we are on that edge. And Sri Aurobindo teaches us how to make that transition. What is the nature and the scope of that transition and the divinization. And this is what we are studying here. The understanding sets the ground for the mind, but also provides a frame for the heart's aspiration and gives a practical form through which to orient our lives to this realization. And this is now the challenge before us. how do you bridge this gap? And we first recognize the double nature of the manifestation. There is the higher nature of Satchidananda in which he is found, and lower nature of mind, life and body in which he is veiled. And we have to reconcile the two in the underlying unity. So he says, we have not to leave them separate so that we live a sort of double life. Spiritual within and above, mental and material in our active and earthly living. We have to review and remold the lower living in the light, force and joy of the higher reality. We have to realize matter as a sense-created mold of spirit, a vehicle for all manifestation of the light, force and joy of Satchidananda in the highest conditions of terrestrial being and activity. And so on, he describes each of these, how they are to be recast. But the first idea is this: you cannot leave these separate. At first, they will be separate because that's how it is. But we cannot leave it separate, we have to work to unite. The removal of the veil is not something which happens in one sudden movement in which the two merge. It is a progressive thing. But the progressive may lead you through sudden stages of awakening, sudden stages of change, but still there are many things which need to happen in this complete unification of the upper and the lower. So first he says, we have to review and remold the lower living in the light, force and joy of the higher reality. Review and remold. Before you can mold, you have to view. The viewing, reviewing, will set the stage for the remolding. And what we have done now in this study of the paragraph, conceiving the divine thus, is already beginning the review process. We had a view which was false, which was limited, which was what we had to begin with. And he's showing us how you can review. And the key distinction of the review is the recognition of the underlying unity. The recognition of the conscious divine presence which forms and is everything. And even if it is at first only in the mind's idea, as you dwell upon it, very quickly the heart begins to fill that idea. There's a very interesting advice given in certain circles where they teach you, fake it till you make it. I don't know if you've heard the phrase. Fake it, meaning pretend, until it becomes true to you. Now, on a very crude level, it does not work, of course. You can fake being nice with somebody, and well, you can still continue to hate in your heart, pretend to be nice. Well, it doesn't work. Eventually, what's fake will fail. But the truth of this idea is active when what you fake represents a deeper truth. And if you're aware of that deeper truth, then the fake pretense gives a chance for the deeper truth to come forward and fill and replace the fakery. If you're aware, in your thought even, that finally we are all conscious souls in evolution, that there is this divine presence in the other, although I hate him. You're aware of it somewhere and you pretend to be nice. This awareness sustained gives a chance, your nice pretense gives a chance for this awareness to begin to fill the form. Let's say I hate a person. If every day I meet the person, I only shower abuses, I never have a chance really to allow a deeper truth of love, affection, understanding or harmony to come forward. When I create the context of a pretense, smiling, hi, how are you, wish you a good day, and somewhere part of my mind says, I wish you suffer. But in that pretense, there's a chance for something of the heart to come forward. Because I cannot pretend really well unless something genuine is brought forward. And so a chance is there. And that chance repeatedly, as if digging grooves, replaces the fake appearance with something more genuine. And one day I say, well, why am I hating him? I don't really feel the need for it anymore. And poof, it's gone. That fake layer has dropped and a genuine feeling can fill. The idea here is that when you reorient your view, the truth which is within has a chance to come forward. You begin to think just the idea that there is this one underlying presence, one reality, one consciousness, one mind, one life, one substance, which is forming all these. Just that idea, bit by bit, will allow the deeper perception of this truth to come forward and fill what starts with a mental idea. In fact, what Sri Aurobindo does in the way he articulates, of course words touch you first at the level of an idea, but he has infused into the words the imprint of his experience. So while the idea is formed, something touches you deeply and moves you deeply and already kickstarts that process. And that's why the reading and rereading with that intention assists in the reshaping. So you start with a review, which may be more mental because you're thinking it, but into that your heart begins to fill and the deeper parts of you begin to slowly reflect. If your mind is so fixated in the false idea, the truth cannot reflect in it, or the reflection is fragmented. When the mind extends itself, becomes clearer, the truth can reflect more, and the reflection of a truth is true. Paves the way for the truth now to fill and become the substance of this. And so we review, and as a result there is a remoulding which begins. And as that begins to happen, you feel it. Ah, yes, I feel it. And then I consciously begin to participate in what I feel. And that's when the remoulding consciously can take place. So review prepares the ground for an automatic remold, which then takes the form of a conscious participation in the remoulding. We have to review and remold what? The lower living in the light, force and joy of the higher reality. And he has used 3 words, light, force and joy. Notice how they correspond to the knowledge, the power and the bliss, Chit, Shakti and Ananda. The existence is of course already there in a certain sense, in the fact that we are aware that we exist. But into this, more and more of the light, force and joy of the higher reality has to come. Again, here we can start with a review. And the review is to recognize that this light is already here. Where is it? Right here, all around you, filling the whole universe. Where is Sachidananda? Here, around you, filling the whole universe. Yes, there are spaces where you feel it more easily. If you go into the sunlight, well, you see light much more easily than if you're in a cave. If you go near a sacred space, you go approach the Matri Mandir, you experience the spiritual light much more easily than if you're in the marketplace. But the light is only concealed when you don't feel it. It is there. And just that idea. When you feel most lost, most distant, most abandoned by the divine presence or your own sense of joy or self-worth, recognize that the light is right here. All that has happened is you have desensitized or you have forgotten to feel it. And if you cannot feel it, it can still feel you. It still knows you. And you reorient yourself by saying, all right, I can't feel it, but since it knows me, I can call it. And you turn your consciousness, rather than saying, I am miserable, well, you say, I am miserable, but I open myself to a greater delight. Fill me. Free my misery. So I consciously turn to the light and the action of the light, the force and the delight of which this is an expression. I open myself to it, knowing it is right here, even within me. It can take a more personal form. You know her. Remember, it is being, conscious being. You know her as the Divine Mother. Her light, her force, her bliss. And you open yourself to her. Where is she? Right here, permeating the full substance of your being, your mind, your emotions, the whole universe. Not only embracing from outside, but filling from inside every grain. It is her energy that forms the life energy that flows in you. Her mind that forms your mental awareness. So where is she? Most intimately, the very substance of your being. What is separating you? Your self-obsession, your false concentration on your own limitation and unhappiness. And momentarily you break free from it and say, help me, Divine Mother, fill me with your light and force and joy. So the lower living opens to the higher reality, which is right here, interpenetrating, not far away. But the act of opening invites and allows the action to enter. And automatically the process of change begins. Except that initially, in the opening, there are still two parts. One part which opens and one part which refuses. So this part in the mind may say, here, help me. And some other part in the heart says, but I want to remain in my misery. Not consciously, but that's the instinct of the self-pity or depression. It wants to wallow in itself. And so a part opens and that part experiences. But that forms a link to the part which refuses. Eventually, gradually cajoles it to open also, until the whole of what you're conscious is filled, and then suddenly the darkness is gone. Bit by bit, the whole being thus undergoes a reviewing and a remoulding. But remember, the first shift is in conscious reviewing. And we begin with that aspect of the review which is most easy for us. But if you have the full picture of the review, it is of course much more complete. Then, now he gives you what is the nature of the review. What's the full scope in which we have to see ourselves. We have to realize matter as a sense-created mold of spirit, a vehicle for all manifestation of the light, force and joy of Satchidananda in the highest conditions of terrestrial being and activity. All this is substance, mold of spirit in which the spirit can play. But the mold is created by the senses. Because my eyes see, because my senses touch, I have the sense of a shape. What is the glass? It's made of pure energy. The same energy which makes my body, the same energy which makes the stone is forming the same glass. But the pattern of sense reflection, contact, is what gives to it its special characteristic. Everything is sense-created mold. And the senses are created by what? Your mind. So the mind looking through the senses is giving these distinct forms. This is glass, this is flower, this is wood. They're separate. Because the mind is separate, its sense creations also give you the sense of separateness. But that's fine, we accept it. But we see each of these as a mold for the spirit. And as a mold, it also allows the spirit to move through. So as a vehicle for all manifestation of light, force and joy of Satchidananda. And all increase of light, force and joy of Satchidananda is the sense of growth in the vehicle. We touched upon this last time. The flower, when it blooms, is revealing more and more of the Satchidananda in its form, in its color, in its perfume. And so we will call it an evolutionary growth. When it wilts, breaks down and falls, the Satchidananda that it revealed is once again lost and concealed. And so we will say a de-evolution or a fading or breakdown. But all vehicles, all forms, all molds in the matter are meant to be vehicles for the manifestation of increasing light, force and joy. So when the flower bursts out a little bit of the Satchidananda and breaks down and again grows back through the tree, the same material in different form as a leaf, as a flower, as various other things, the animal eating the leaf and the flower, becoming now tissue in the body, expressing mind, everything is assisting in gradually increasing the manifestation of light, force and joy of Satchidananda. That's all we see in matter. Matter gives you the mold and the vehicle for increasing expression of light, force and joy of Satchidananda, including this matter which is your body, which inhabits your life energies and mind, meant for increasing expression of light, force and joy of Satchidananda in the highest conditions of terrestrial being and activity. Here we are as human beings. We have the highest possibilities in all of the earth's activities. And in these highest conditions, how much more can you bring in of light, force and joy of Satchidananda? In that is the fulfillment of your form and your body. Next, he says, we have to see life as a channel for the infinite force divine and break the barrier of a sense-created and mind-created farness and division from it, so that the divine power may take possession of and direct and change all our life activities until our vitality transfigured ceases in the end to be the limited life force which now supports mind and body and becomes a figure of the all blissful conscious force of Satchidananda. It's a long one, but there are three major ideas. First, we see our own life, capital L. So life energy, not just my life, the fellow who's born and dies. The life energy itself which is in me, as a channel for the infinite force, capital F, divine. What's a channel? You have an ocean, you cut a channel, and a little bit of the water flows through. Out of something which is infinite, a finite projection, extension. Of the sun, which is light and heat, a single ray would be a channel. So of that infinite divine force, your life energy and the form of it as your life is one channel. In other words, you are the infinite divine force pouring itself into a narrow stream to form this living individual. And through this series of living forms flowing on as the single stream across lives of the infinite force which is divine. And you think of yourself, review, and with that the remoulding will take place. Review yourself as this. When in distress, when in incapacity, when you feel the challenges before you are hopeless, remind yourself that the energy and effort that you personally put is a tiny piece. Behind that is this infinite divine force, of which a stream forms this, of which a tiny egocentric energy thrust is your personal effort. But within you is the action of that infinite force. Backing it is the totality of the infinite force. And through you, that can act in spite of your limitations, because it has no limitations. See, the logic is very simple. You have limitations, you cannot do more than this much. That acts through your limitations, but you'll say, but it's bound to my limitations? No. It is free of all limitation. So it is free of your limitation also, and can act through you in spite of your limitation. It has the power to lift you to any extent as necessary, or drop you back into your limitation as necessary, for some purpose. It is in this way that we recognize the work of a vibhuti. In history, there have been so many great beings who came as emanations of the divine consciousness and force for a specific purpose. They were human, with the same genetics, with the same physical capacity, the same biological basis for life and mind, and yet through them a far greater force would act. Not always consistently, sometimes in bursts. They too had their difficulties and contradictions and conflicts. Swami Vivekananda for many years used to struggle with doubts whether the divine exists at all, whether it's not just a big scam. But when it came to the experience would burst through. Joan of Arc had her own periods of conflict and internal distress. But when the light came, she was seized and lifted into a divine capacity, and then withdrew as necessary for the work. And this is true for each one of us. Your limitations don't count for that which is beyond limitation. It can override your own limitations. And so if limitation is permitted, often it serves a purpose in your evolution. Because the goal is not to miraculously lift, that is also done when necessary, but to fundamentally transform the whole nature. And this is often done by a progressive process rather than a miraculous intervention. So the miraculous interventions come to assist, to so to say, expand the capacity a little bit, and then the material is allowed to settle back into its normal rhythms, and then slowly extended and stretched so that it doesn't snap, it doesn't break too much. And this is for the long-term transformation. But you begin by seeing life as a channel for the infinite force. Now, not just in you, now you extend this to life, capital L, in all forms. Every life form is a channel for the infinite divine force. And now you look around you, all the trees and all the flowers and all the birds and all the animals and all the human beings, and even the rocks, because they also express life in a very crude form. Everything is a channel for the divine force. And the universe itself is one gigantic outpouring of the divine force. So we have to see life as a channel for the infinite force divine, and he says, break the barrier of a sense-created and mind-created farness and division from it. What is it that makes us feel as if that energy, that divine infinite force is far away? Sense-created and mind-created farness. So the sense-created farness is easy to see. Well, this is a little flower. It's a finite object which is held in your hand. It cannot be more powerful than your own hand and your own intelligence, or so it seems. When you actually enter the intricate processes inside the life, you will see often it can do things far greater than you. As an example, one of the mysteries of biology is that under certain circumstances, a chicken will lay eggs which contain more calcium than it is eating. Now, you give it good nutrition, you can say, all right, it's building it out of the nutrition. When the nutrition is deficient, it still builds more calcium than it's eating. And the only conclusion we would have is, in the biological process, there is the equivalent of an atomic reactor which is fusing atoms. Fusion is taking place in a biological process. If you put it in these terms, you'll be thrown out of biology and physics, at least in the conventional arena. But the evidence is there, it's happening. Where does this material get synthesized from? And it has to happen at an atomic level. And physics tells us fusion requires huge amounts of energy. Well, one day we will discover how life energy works it out in the biology, and we will see how it captures huge amounts of energy by a very simple process in which you don't see enormous amounts of heat, but the energy is still captured. And this is the nature of the working of life, because it is always an expression of the infinite force. So, with our senses, we have the illusion because it's small, because it's packaged, because it has a border, this is all it has. No. We break that idea with the mind, see that it is a concentration of this huge energy. Remind yourself that when this thing moves, when this thing changes form, it is linked to the whole universe, and the whole universe is pouring into it. And suddenly you begin to see it differently. And similarly with the mind. With the mind, we have given ourselves this wrong idea that things are limited. We are limited because it has been so always. It doesn't need to be, because it is always a balance held by conscious energy. And with this, we convince ourselves, we recognize and we see this truth, and the division, the sense of farness begins to fade, so that that divine power may take possession of and direct and change all our life activities. So again it goes through 3 stages. As this false sense of farness fades out, the division is reduced, that divine power may take possession of our life activities. Next step, direct our life activities. And third step, change our life activities. So first it has to begin to fill you. Then, having filled you, it begins to direct. And eventually it creates a completely new rhythm in which the life processes within you are transformed. Completely changed. But first it has to fill you. Now a very simple exercise where you remove the mind-created farness is to become conscious in your mind as an awareness that the life energy inside you is a small part of the universal life energy. So in your mind you conceive of the universal life energy filling all around like an ocean. Like the fish which is drinking water, so to say, the water of the ocean is going right through it, in and out. The life energy is pouring into you and passing out. Just become aware of this as an idea, and then as an awareness, as an experience. And you will notice after a while there is a kind of a bubble, a limit which you have put, I and not I. And this begins to thin, or you consciously thin it. You feel the life energy outside you and invite or feel it pouring into you or passing through you increasingly, until you are able to consciously will or draw or just feel it flowing right through you, filling you. And at that point you will find with your mind's awareness you can intend it. You can intend it to fill more and increase what is filled in you until you will feel your energy growing internally. Until you will feel and experience more energy inside you than outside you. And you're fully fresh, awake and energetic. And all you did was change the mind-created farness, removed the false barrier of division, and allowed that energy to enter and possess, fill you. Except we are doing this not just with the physical life force, not just with the prana, but with the divine life energy, which is what we align ourselves to. Remember, there's the lower nature and the higher nature. In the lower, things are still concealed, in the higher they are revealed. So you can draw on the lower and get a lot of vitality, but you can draw on the higher, and the quality of energy filling you will hold oneness, will not be separating energy. In the lower energy, what happens? For example, you form a unit, a family. You have broadened out of your little individual, but you have bound yourself now in a larger unit. You grow out of the family unit, you bind yourself in the nation unit, bind yourself in the planetary unit. The nature of the lower life energy is, however large, still finite and divided. Because that's the habit, that's the tendency ingrained in the life force. But when you open to that divine power, of which this life is a channel, the infinite force which knows oneness, when it fills you, it awakens the sense of oneness even in the life force. And when that fills, when that directs and that changes your life activities, it recasts it in terms of the underlying unity, the oneness. And that is what leads to a spiritual transformation of your life energies. Until our vitality transfigured ceases in the end to be the limited life force which now supports mind and body, and becomes a figure of the all blissful conscious force of Satchidananda, a form of the all blissful force of the Satchidananda now pouring through this focal point. And this is the goal. He shows you the process, and you must continue this until it reaches all the way to that. And we have similarly to change our sensational and emotional mentality into a play of the divine love and universal delight. And we will have to surcharge the intellect which seeks to know and will in us with the light of the divine knowledge will, until it is transformed into a figure of that higher and sublime activity. So 2 more steps. First, change of the sensational and emotional mentality, and change of the intellect. Both are part of the mind transformation. Why he splits the mind into these 2 zones is important, and so we will have to discuss it in some detail next time. But you see the same idea in these 2 layers of the mind's awareness. You surcharge with that which is the divine knowledge, of which this is a small part, and the universal delight, of which this sensational and emotional mentality is a small distorted reflection. In each opening to the higher equivalent, its source, of which it is a form, allowing that to pour in by a shift first of your perception, of your reviewing, and then as it fills you, it begins to direct more and more, replacing the old lower, lesser instincts by the higher impulsions, until it recasts entirely your whole nature into its terms of a divine nature. This is essentially the process in all these parts. We will pause here and take up this last sentence next Friday. And we can now take up any questions or comments. Yes. I should read it all. Okay. What would be the attitude of the one who has transcended the 3 gunas towards life and society? And here, that's what we have been reading. The attitude is to see all as expressions, progressive expressions of the divine. Everything is divine essentially, but not expressing the divinity. But it is a vehicle through which the expression of divinity has to grow. Our role is to participate in that growth, and where possible to consciously assist it in us and in our circumstances. Where that which is beyond our circumstances, we observe the growth of that and align ourselves in goodwill to assist that growth. What is within our circumstances, we consciously participate and assist in that change. And the reference he has given us is light, force and joy of Satchidananda. In the highest conditions of terrestrial being and activity. There are higher conditions possible, but terrestrially what is right now possible, we begin with that. And a little nudge, and a little nudge. You have a question? Yes.
I guess one thing that I find interesting is when you talk about the divine play and the steeping into the very deepest of ignorance, so it's almost a self-forgetfulness.
Mm-hmm.
It's that you get avatars that come down like Mother and Sri Aurobindo, and yet even they had to participate in such a grimness of the struggle itself, so it almost seems as if they had to self-forget a little bit of what they were as well.
Yes. The nature of the avatar, the nature of the avataric role is precisely for the divine to enter into the full challenge of the human substance, and from within that to break out to reveal the divinity. And in so doing, cut a passage in this very substance. Remember, it is universal substance. So even if in one body it is able to cut through this passage of awakening, it has imprinted in universal substance the capacity now. And instead of seeing it as something which is a loss, if you look from the highest position, remember everything was put out for the play of the divine. Self-exploration, so to say. So it is part of the divine play even to participate in this from below as well as from above. And so the divine chooses to participate in this way. If you look at the same picture from below, you will say, the divine puts on so much suffering, takes up such a great burden. But if you look at the same picture from above, it is a joy to enter this experience of suffering and struggle and overcome it. So Mother makes this observation, and it's something very profound in our overall education and evolution. She says, you notice when you have a desire, there is a joy in satisfying the desire. And then there is a joy in overcoming the desire. And between the two, the joy of overcoming is far greater than the joy of indulging. Interesting. Why? Because in the act of overcoming, you have grown. In the act of enjoying, you have also grown, but in a much lesser way. In overcoming, you have actually grown in a substantial leap in consciousness. Now, if you observe this idea and extend it now to everything in life, every time we overcome a difficulty, external or internal, we have an enormous joy of that growth. Because this is closest to the sense of evolution. If you participate and move in the joys of the moment, it's the zigzag path. It is also evolution, but it is the slow progress. In overcoming, you've skipped a whole zigzag stage and gone straight up to the next level. And sometimes having gone straight up in one part, something is missing, we drop back to complete some partial zigzag and come up again. So the sense of growth is so fulfilling. And even the divine, when it takes up the burden of the human experience and struggles through it, it is really a movement of delight, of growth. And when the divine does it for humanity, in the human nature and consciousness itself, what it does is something extraordinary. It ripples out into the whole of humanity. And that's why in the physical presence of the avatar's manifestation, you will find across humanity suddenly this awakening of hope and the sense that yes, it's possible, it's so close. Sri Aurobindo refers to this in one of his writings, and this is written in the 1910s or so. He says, everywhere there is this idea of new possibilities, new revolutionary changes, and hope of some ideals, and it feels as if it can happen, it's right here, it's so close. And you see, particularly after the Second World War, a kind of a decline in this hope, a cynicism which replaces the hope. And that is typically the pushback from the resistance in the, you will say, the darkness. But again and again it comes back. And we are in one of those times again when the hope is rising. If we catch that, it pushes up. It's an aspect of the Satchidananda, an aspect of the delight which fills everything and shows you, it removes this veil of farness and division and shows you that it's actually close and makes it almost seizable in that moment. And this is the nature of the avatar's imprint in humanity. And we are at that time still. That's why he says in the hour of God, there are moments when the Spirit moves among men and the breath of the Lord is abroad upon the waters of our being. And at that time he says, a little bit of effort produces great results and changes destiny. Why? Because this gap is thinned out and the little bit of effort allows you to make that leap. If nothing else, we hold this one single idea that everything in life is meant to be a vehicle for the manifestation of the light, force and joy of Satchidananda, including ourselves. And every event in our life is meant to assist that, in whatever way. Even so-called negative events which come to knock us are meant to help in the development of the light, force or joy. And sometimes for the force particularly, the knock, if it pushes you back in some way, it's because it has broken a weakness or incapacity. And in the rebuilding, in the rehealing, the capacity will grow much more. And your capacity to hold the light, force and joy will also grow. Often in life we have setbacks, and sometimes major setbacks, which could last years even. But when you come through the setback, you realize you have been remolded and recast. Now much wider, more strong, more deep. During the setback, you feel as if you have shrunk. Your boundaries were broken and you have shrunk. But the boundaries were broken so that in their rebuilding now they can never grow back as they were. They'll always be wider and freer. So instead of struggling to go back to what you were, you make the conscious effort to move forward to what must be. And this is the secret of dealing with challenges, with problems. The error we make is every time we have a problem, something is disoriented or put out of order, we try to go back to what was, because that used to work. And it's being broken to help you to go to what is to be, not what was. And if you accept that, you consciously reach out. What do I want it to be like? Conceive of it. Start reviewing. And then with the reviewing, the remoulding will begin. And you will recast yourself in a larger, greater consciousness of light, force and joy of Satchidananda. Where you don't know how it should be, all the better. That means the possibilities are even greater. Because when you know, you've already fixed yourself in what you know. So you open and ask her, help me now. But accept that what will grow will be greater and larger. And try to grow into what must be. Sri Aurobindo in this formulation helps us, leads us into this whole transforming process. And in the conscious action of his force, that is the Divine Mother, the work is actually done. We'll continue this next Friday.